Computer. And we are recording. So folks, welcome along to this week's edition of Wisdom on Wednesday, or Wednesday's Wisdom. With me today, I've got John Dean, aka JD, who is the founder of a business known as Sales Director Central. And JD, how long have we actually known each other, roughly?
I think we probably first had a conversation 5 or 6 years ago, I reckon.
Okay, all right, cool. So what's been interesting for me over the kind of last 5 or 6 years, you and I find, get into some really, really deep conversations around the subject of sales. And if I was to kind of put a label on you from a style perspective, what I've really enjoyed about you is I find you really philosophical. Right? You seem to have a kind of philosophical approach about this thing called selling. How do you feel about that as a moniker and as a label?
I feel a tiny bit uncomfortable with it, but I think what has always interested and fascinated me is human dynamics.
Right.
Is not what happened, it's why it happened and where it's going. And when I think about helping people, often it's not do this next, it's not follow the bouncing ball, although that's really helpful. It's understanding where it came from and where you're going to. And maybe that's that philosophical approach that you're talking about, but it's more, I'm interested in why someone is doing what they're doing rather than what they're doing.
Right.
So that behavioural element and how do I change it? And again, you can be told here's the 5 things to do, but if you don't know you're driving a Formula One car, it's irrelevant. Right? There's no point.
Yeah, right. Cool. So here we are in the year 2020, right? We've arrived in this fantastic future, and people would have us believe that sales has changed. What do you reckon of that? Has it?
What do you reckon that sales has changed? In what way do they reckon it's changed?
Well, there's the whole, the buyer is much more educated now, and they've got much more information on your value proposition before they've even made contact with you. They're not interested in having you cold calling them. Social selling is the go. I mean, any number of different things.
Right.
Gone away from features and benefits. It's challenger selling.
Yeah, right. Okay. There's a slide when I present, but I ask the audience a question. Is buying or selling harder or easier than 10 years ago?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really interesting response from the audience typically. Invariably, it starts out with it's easier because I think that internet, we're in an age of information and an age of trust to a large extent.
Yep.
And then they kind of come back and say it's kind of harder. And I guess I throw that open mostly because one of the stats that I've seen, somewhere between 57 and 69% of the sales cycle happens before someone calls you. So you're right, there's a lot more information online. I remember my very first question in a presentation from an IT perspective, the guy asked me a question about a 286 AT computer back in the 80s, and he said, should I buy a 20 meg hard drive or a 40 meg hard drive? And younger me said, you're never going to fill up 20 megabytes. So there's a lot more information out there. I think the process of buying hasn't changed. It's still, I did a post recently, exchange of value. It's still a value exchange between the buyer and the seller. You want to solve a problem. I've got a solution to your problem. The nuances, if I think about 20 years ago, I was senior guy, general manager of an IT business, and I had a $50,000 sign-off.
Right.
If it was above a certain amount, I'd always check with my boss. I'd always check in and make sure he was cool with the process. In that same organisation, it's now owned by a bigger company, significantly bigger company now. That same organisation, I think the sign-off for that role is 5K, and there's another 5 or 6 people. So it hasn't changed in that you buy, you sell, you buy and you exchange information, you exchange the value. It has changed in terms of getting what Tony Hughes calls consensus of change. That's dramatically harder I believe, than it was some time ago in enterprise sales.
Right.
But the whole process of turning up and talking to a client, adding value to them, I don't think that has changed since whatever the first sales job was.
So that's really interesting. And I saw that post and it really resonated with me, and I made a comment on it. And that it was that coming to grips with the notion of this is about an exchange of value was a turning point for me. You know, I've shared with you, we've had lots of conversations around the fact that, you know, for a good number of years, I was in denial about being in sales.
Oh.
You know, I wasn't in sales. I was the CEO or the general manager or the director of quality, or I didn't do sales. That was somebody else's job in the business. And you know, I built up this fear about having to be a salesperson. But the moment I came to understand the notion of, no, it's about a fair exchange of value, that really changed things for me.
Right.
Right.
How did that come about?
Well, it really was just, I think it was a combination of getting to a point where I think what was happening was that clients were expressing absolute enjoyment and satisfaction with the service that I and we were providing to them, and that they were getting enormous value out of it, right? And that they were getting a value that was above and beyond what they'd expected, certainly different to what they had experienced. And so, you know, when that started to gel for me, that what we were actually giving to them really was genuine value.
Right.
I don't know, the next logical step for me seemed to be to not be worried about this thing called selling anymore, because, you know, I was doing something that was considered to be worthwhile.
I had a really interesting conversation yesterday with someone you know about storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And she was telling me why storytelling and sales are so linked, and they are. Inexorably, great salespeople tell great stories and have a good structure for that. And she said it was different to selling. And I said, I actually see it as the same thing. Selling is communicating. And the better you are at communicating, using stories, using solve questions, whatever that process is, the better off you are to get to an outcome, a mutual agreeable outcome. So I often look at sales, and it does have a moniker, it does have a perception with a bunch of people. It's just communicating with people, really. Ultimately, it's a mechanism of having a discussion with someone, and whether you're delivering something, whether you're a barrister, whether you drive a bus, everyone sells a teacher. You all sell notion, knowledge, information, process, whatever that is. So we're all doing it all the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's home in on that just a little bit more, because, you know, on my side of the fence as a recruiter, one of the things that we talk to our clients about is the fact that often as not, they fall into the trap. And, you know, most of our clients are small business owners who are recruiting their first sales professional.
Right.
And some of them kind of get overawed by the salesperson or the salespeople coming along at interview. And I often talk about the fact that a lot of small business owners fall into the trap of falling in love with the best storyteller.
Right.
Right.
Well, the best blagger, right? The best talker.
Yeah, the blagger, the talker. Yeah, absolutely. You know, and so that old-fashioned notion of could talk underwater with a mouthful of marbles kind of guy, ad man stuff comes out. Is that deserved, do you think? I mean, it seems to me that was how things were. And yet, you know, a moment ago you were saying, I think it's always been about exchange of value, but it seems as though this other version of selling was also true.
I think, would they call it travelers back in the day? I mean, I think that notion of what sales is, some guy with snakeskin oil or with some medicine that goes from town to town and plies his wares, which I guess is an evolution we've got to, is that person doing that stuff. And maybe it falls back to that stuff. I know that when I interview someone, I'm not interested in the stuff they're telling me. I'm interested in the questions they're asking me.
Right.
I am interested in understanding. I've got a question I ask in a sales meeting. I shouldn't say it in case someone I'm meeting tomorrow sees this podcast. But I've got a question, which is just tell me about your best customer. And all I'm interested in is how much you know about the customer. I'm not, and I got to tell you, the amount of times I've asked that singular question and I seeded an RFP, which is awesome. My best mate was a CIO, and I'm looking to steal a line from Survivor when you outwitted, outplayed, out-strategized the other person, and how do you rinse and repeat that? Mm-hmm. And the other problem that I see, and you must as well, is that they hire someone and leave them to fail. So you've got a blagger who, for whatever reason, has become scared of the phone, wants to make everything digital, and then 3 months later, the boss comes back and says, "Why haven't you sold anything?" And we're going to have a different conversation in another 2 months about your longevity in the business. I mean, it's not set up well, right? The whole process from start to finish is not set up well. And those poor people who have created that product, right? That I remember having a prospect once in my first meeting with him. He said, "JD, before we really got into the flow, he says, JD, I need you to know 2 things. I hate people and I hate selling." and I offer people a money back guarantee, have for a long time. And I had moments in the next 10 seconds of, you know what, this is too hard. If you hate people, hate selling, I can't modify that. Mm-hmm. I didn't for whatever reason. 2 months later, he says, "I don't know what you're doing, but I'm starting to like this." And it was really simple. I stopped him blagging, talking about his product, and started getting him talking about his passion. Yeah. And it's a really easy shift. And I think the notion of what sales is, it's not about the feature phone. I mean, we've talked about this ad nauseum, right? Yeah. Your product is actually irrelevant to the sale. Yeah. Absolutely irrelevant.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that was a really big breakthrough for me. You know, when I kicked off the recruitment business a couple of years ago, I was absolutely obsessed with the behavioral science and the marriage of that with technology and how clever our mousetrap was. And, you know, I would be singing high praises left, right and centre to anybody who would give me 30 seconds about how clever our methodology was.
Yeah. We all fall into the trap. I was doing a presentation. I was doing this webinar series mid last year, just after we started Sales Director Central. And I realised that we did a webinar or a masterclass, and I realised halfway through it, this is the stuff I tell my clients not to do. It's talking about all of the mousetrap, talking about this stuff that we thought was super clever. Yeah. And we went back to what I have been doing for presentations for the last 12 or 13 years, which is talking about problems and issues and how we go over them. And so we all fall into it, right? I mean, no one's immune from that process. But the quicker you have that realization, the more likely you are to move into a stage of more rapid growth and scale, which is ultimately, I guess, what we're both connected to inextricably.
Yeah. So a little while ago, probably about 18 months ago, if memory serves me, you put a post up on LinkedIn and it was the dare thing. I dare you not to mention your company name, yeah? I dare you not to talk about your product. Talk to us some more about that. And I don't know, we've kind of just been touching on it, but how does somebody actually do that?
To take the dare on?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've had the luxury for the last 16 years consulting, and then more recently with Sales Director Central, of looking at, I don't know what the number is, I've looked at 2,000 sales meetings, some number of sales meetings. Mm-hmm. I've seen probably 10,000 prospect meetings in that time. And so what you start to do is gather a whole bunch of evidence of what works and what doesn't work. Yep. And so I haven't done a research paper on it. What I've discovered was the people who knew their products intimately, every poor salesperson knew their product well. Right. Most gun salespeople may know the product. They definitely understand the customer. Wow. So there was this shift from my perspective of, and you know, like I said, in my early days, I remember my old boss used to talk about playing the piano for a prospect. And if you're hitting the right keys, they kind of sing along with you. Mm-hmm. So the keyboard became this piano process he went through. And that's all feature, function, and capability stuff. But what I realized is, and even early on in my process, I was really more interested in the customer and where they were at than what we had to offer. And so the DARE is a real one. It's $100 fine for the clients that I mentor. It's trust-based. Obviously, I don't go to all the sales calls with them. But what tends to happen in that quiet moment with a prospect is you revert to stuff that's natural behavior, which is talking about the stuff, the mousetrap, as you really like when they put it. And if you don't do that, what you're left with is understanding why you're going to buy, who's going to sign off on it, what the critical event, some things that actually move the sale along substantially more than they like my stuff. Most poor salespeople have got a pipeline full of prospects that like their stuff. And in fact, if you haven't sold well, your pipeline is overinflated with prospects that like your stuff.
Right.
Because they can't fire me because my pipeline's looking good. And I own all these relationships.
Yeah.
And in reality, the answer is the opposite, that you have a relationship at a very superficial level, at a product-based capability level. And if you understood the keys to the castle, you'd be understanding a lot more about why people have bought or haven't bought from you.
Yeah. Which is really weird, because I've sent out half a dozen proposals this week.
Right. I sat in a sales meeting in the last couple of months, and it was my first sales meeting. Part of our review process is to look at your cradle to grave approach. And the commentary in the sales meeting was honestly in and around that someone didn't return his call in a week and they were going to kill the opportunity. And it was a sizable opportunity for their business.
Right.
And so there was this notion of, hey, if what we said was high value, why haven't they got back to us? Why aren't we moving this thing forward? Rather than, hey, I've got an idea, ask them, what's the process? When am I going to hear from you next? Who needs to sign off on it? What does that look like? Is it going to take you 4 months, or are we going to do something next week? And all that stuff. So there's the gap from my mind in the good and the bad guys. The good guys understand those drivers really well. In fact, one of the people I'm really fortunate to do some work with was in a meeting with a very large US giant. I almost said the place, their head office name, which would give it away. And the CTO of this organization came into the room. I don't know if I've told you this story. And he said, who here is from our competitor? And my mate said, I am. And he was told to leave the room. And he told him, last year you wrote off $9 million worth of blah, blah, blah. And if I walk out the room, you might do it again. Otherwise, we should have a meaningful conversation around how we can save that cost to you. Not only did he stay in the room, he took an $18 million check from that business. So most salespeople, I don't think, would have the gravitas, would have the business acumen to stay in that meeting. They would get up and go.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think then that business acumen is one of the fundamentals today for success in sales?
I think understanding how a business, what is the heartbeat of a business and how do they make buying decisions is super important.
Yeah.
The same person I just mentioned a moment ago asks people late in deals, can you show me a business case that you have got approved? So he understands the process in that. In fact, this same guy, I'll embarrass him if he sees this podcast, but we were working on a deal together with a very substantial recruiting firm worldwide. And the CFO of the business actually rang him and apologized that he got the process wrong. Not many people, I don't think many people would have that level of the CFO saying, hey, I know I said it was A and B sign it. It's actually A, B and board. Yep. And I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
So it's he navigates what I call the last mile really well.
Right.
I did a post recently, said 80%, some years ago I learned this stat, 80% of business cases internally written at Optus get rejected because they don't make the hurdle and an excellent, it's 85% that's from an ex-CFO.
Right.
So there's a lot of people spending a lot of time in those two organizations trying to get the mousetrap in to the business, trying to get the thing because it's costing them a lot of effort and time, but not understanding hurdle rate, just the cost of money in the business, but understanding the internal process or appetite for change. I think the difference between people who go okay and the guys that do well is they understand and really manage that part of the process really well.
Yeah, cool. A few minutes back, you made reference to the song and dance guy who's just rocked up into the business and has developed a phobia of picking up the phone, and so he wants to make everything digital, etc., etc. What are your thoughts on the future of cold calling? You know, there seem to be two camps. There's the it's dead, it's gone forever, and it's the don't be ridiculous. What are your thoughts on it?
I don't know a quicker way to get a lead. So if you've got, I think the challenge with cold calling, we call it value prospecting, but the challenge with cold calling is typically by osmosis, you've learnt a process or you've got some sort of, dare I say, script in your head. And, you know, if you're bad at doing 10 calls, then you're really bad at doing 100. And that just manifests and continues to go through a process. And you might snag one with greater reach. I don't know a quicker process for getting a name. If I make 20 calls this afternoon, you know, my likelihood of getting a meeting with someone is very high. If I send out, I don't know what the equivalent is, 200 in-mails, I might get a lead some stage. I might snag something, but my likelihood is that it's going to take a lot longer. So I don't think the process of calling is dead. I like the idea of direct mail pieces now, because I don't think that happens to many executives right now, right?
Yeah.
Imagine sending, and again, I don't know if we've had this chat, some years ago, there was 5 people on a panel at an event, 5 CIOs. And I found out someone gave me a Christmas present, which was these 3 nuts in a box with a nutcracker. And it was really nicely presented. I rang the person who gave it and I said, look, this is a really super rude question. Apologies in advance. How much was the present? And she said $10, which I was a bit offended by. But anyway, I moved on from that. But it was this really nice gift. And I said, can you get 5 more from me? I got 4 meetings out of those, sending those 5. So $50 cost plus postage.
Right.
You've got, so how do you break through that noise? How do you get in front of the right person with the right message?
Yeah.
And the value prospecting piece that we have, whether it's cold calling or sending out mail messages, is what is the problem that your client has, and how can you talk to the problem and deal with the pain chain, the buying cycle from Hugh McFarlane, whatever you want to call that. How do you deal with that? Because if I'm more likely to meet you if you talk to my top 3 business problems right now. So I don't think it's dead. I know it's not dead.
Mm-hmm.
I think those that I ran an event maybe 6 years ago with a telco, and I said to them during the session, so I'm pretty flexible with my content when I delivered. I said during the session, do you want me to talk about cold calling? And the boss said yes. And then I said to the audience, do you want me to talk about cold calling? Not realizing that in the last month, they'd all told the boss that it doesn't work and it's flawed, and they completely carved me up. They weren't interested in the message. They weren't interested in the process. They weren't interested in the fact that in the previous week, another one of my clients got a meeting with Woodside Petroleum CIO using this process. And it's like anything, James, if you don't think it's going to work, you're right. If you do think it's going to work, you're right. If you get a good process, then why isn't that going to be successful? I think another part of the challenge is that a lot of people that we get to talk to, they don't really know who their avatar is. Who's your target market? What are the problems they really have?
Yeah.
You know, we address the insurance industry. We address the financial services sector. Okay, what does that mean? Because if you're throwing bricks at a dartboard, you're really not going to get very far.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's interesting, actually. You've just reminded me when I had the leadership business and first kicked it off. So that was around 2003, so a long time ago now. I don't even know whether the internet had been invented at that point in time. But anyway, we were sending out lead letters, and we were literally putting Johnson's Band-Aids at the top of the letter, and then underneath, and they were going to HR decision makers, and the opening line was, the last thing you need right now is another bloody Band-Aid training course, and we're doing the leadership development stuff, and that really, really, really worked well. So you triggered something in my mind there that maybe we should be going back to the future or something like that.
Let me give you an example of one. I was back in corporate world. We were selling corporate performance management. CPM wasn't called back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
We were selling corporate performance management software, and we were struggling with leads. And as the GM, we decided to again understand our customer and realised that most people do budgeting 3 months before the year end. So we built a database with the year end stuff. I was sending 100 letters on Wednesday, and on Friday we were getting a 5% hit rate. So we would then call 2 days later, and on average I'd get somewhere between 4 and 6 leads because we're hitting people when the pain was highest. We dealt with exactly what the issue was, and we found out the person that had that problem in the business.
Right.
I don't think that's changed. I don't think if you're talking to someone who has a problem with whatever it is that you address their business problem and they have it and it's real, you're going to get a meeting.
Yeah.
However you want to facilitate that. What is your social selling? How many leads do you get from social selling as a percentage of your business?
Well, it's a really good question because it's blown my mind. 2019 calendar year, 90% of our inbound, or 90% of our revenue came from inbound inquiry, right? And about 80 to 90% of that actually was inbound via social, predominantly LinkedIn.
Right.
So that absolutely blows my mind. When I first got onto LinkedIn, there's no way in the world I would have ever believed that could be possible. But the piece that goes with that, of course, is that it's LinkedIn in particular, I think, maybe to some degree Facebook, but LinkedIn has allowed me to be able to do that whole know, like, trust, respect journey without necessarily even knowing, who I'm having the conversation with, who I'm building that with. And to the point that just recently I've had 2 situations where I've had people reach out wanting to engage our services who've been referred to us by somebody else who has seen my stuff on LinkedIn. So they've not done business with me. They've just seen me sharing thoughts, opinions, et cetera, and for whatever reason that's resonated for them. And so, when they've had the conversation with this other person, they said, "Oh, you should try this bloke called James Michael. He'd probably be, just what you're looking for." So I've been quite staggered by that. And so, as a consequence, I haven't been doing any cold calling. I certainly haven't been, getting on the dog and bone and drumming up business in that way. And that's most definitely something that has changed over the last 10 years. The capacity for a platform like that to actually generate inquiry is quite stunning.
We're doing some numbers in Sales Rep Essential, and I think in 1 month last year we had 7 inbound leads, but I couldn't actually put my finger on why, who, or how. Right. So I knew it was an inbound lead. I knew, and some of them had been watching for a long time when I asked them. Some had been just something resonated with them.
Yeah.
But in December it dropped off quite dramatically. I don't know whether people were busy, whether it resonated as much. And I know from my perspective, sometimes I do a post and I think this is more likely to generate some opportunities, and they tend not to.
Yeah.
And the converse is true.
Yeah.
I can't, with the inbound stuff, and you must be a similar boat, you can't turn a tap. Like if you need 20 next month, how do you know that that's going to happen, which is the challenge, right? So you just continue to post and talk to your audience.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. For a small business owner, when's the right time for them to bring on a dedicated salesperson, do you reckon?
Do you remember we had a lunch about 6 or 7 months ago?
Yeah.
We asked that very question, and we had quite an interesting conversation with a bunch of people around the table.
Yeah.
It's probably a combination. It's probably 3 or 4 key things. I think one is when you've either got a pipeline to support that individual, or you've kind of figured out a little bit about the lead gen piece.
Yep.
Hiring a salesperson, expecting them to discover a pipeline that you haven't is probably not reasonable to an extent, although they will bring that skill set.
Yep, agreed.
It's probably that you've got 5, 6, 7 clients and you're spending a lot more time in delivery than not. And so you don't have the attention and span to continue to develop that revenue and keep the flow going. Mm-hmm. So it's probably a combination of activity, being busy. I know that the people that we talk to, and I'm sure you have the same thing, there's a lot of people that I talk to, they're really good at developing the product, the mousetrap, but they're not good at either finding a salesperson or getting them to be any way successful. And one of the things that we often see is you've hired and fired a couple of salespeople and it just hasn't been successful. You've left them in a corner to fail.
Yeah.
So does that answer the question? Do you see other things that that enable someone to think, I need a salesperson?
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. And I think that it's, you know, a time comes where you kind of realize that you're not going to get the business past this point.
Right.
Because, you know, particularly in the B2B space, it takes more people to see more people, right? Eventually conversations need to be had. And so there's only so much bandwidth that any of us have got as business owners. And, you know, go back to your earlier point, most of us get into business as technicians of sorts. You know, we've got that thing that we're deeply passionate about, that thing that we'll end up invoicing. That's the thing we probably want to be focused on for a lot of the time. And so are we the best person to be doing the selling? After a point in time, I think not. And I think that somebody else who is a professional salesperson, a career salesperson, is probably going to do a better job of taking the business past the point that it's reached. So, yeah.
It's interesting. One of the things that we talk to is that if you've gone and developed the mousetrap, let's talk about a product. You've gone and developed the technology. You've got a whole bunch of methodologies to help you develop product with scrums and sprints and all sorts of capabilities. So you have a framework to develop the product.
Yeah.
And what we see, almost 99.9% of the businesses we talk to, is you don't have a process to have a salesperson come in. You don't have a structure. You know, I talk to people. I mean, you've asked me a question before about process versus methodology. Process is, here are the 5, 7, 3 things that we do. Mm-hmm. Methodology is a way of looking at a customer and figuring out whether they're going to buy or not, whether we're going to invest our time. And one of the things that I was reminded by one of my clients last week, you know, the only thing we measure in sales, people think it's revenue, but it's just time. You don't measure revenue in sales. If you spend more time with people who have to make buying decisions, you'll make your number. If you spend more time with people who don't have to make buying decisions, can't get consensus of change, don't understand the business drivers, then they may make their number. More likely they won't. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a false economy that the add-on seeker is going to work. And my other view, and I'd be interested in your view on this, is that I don't want to crap on Seek, but most people who are actively looking at Seek are unemployed. They're looking to get a job.
Yep.
For a lot of my clients, how can I guarantee that this person's going to work? It's a proven history of having a target and exceeding it or meeting it. And again, you know, the people we're looking for are probably engaged in some other business doing, you know, talking to people that we want to be talking to.
Yeah. Yeah. absolutely. And what was interesting for us was that in the last quarter of last calendar year, we were struggling to find good talent and getting people to put their hand up and say, yeah, okay, I'm interested in this opportunity. And even with as much direct outreach as we were doing. And we were being clever in how we're approaching people and using video, and the open rates were through the roof, which was great, but getting people to put their hands up just wasn't happening. And that's changed. So, we've just hit the beginning of February, right? So through January, all of a sudden I'm seeing a lot more uptake and interest and exploration of opportunities. And the thought that suddenly occurred to me was, they've actually been paid their commission check or their bonus check from last quarter.
Yeah.
And that's why they weren't ready to move. Because the people who you really, really want to bring in obviously are achieving and they're earning.
Well,
they're not going to walk away from that, are they?
Well, it's interesting. One of the questions, again, one of my secrets, one of my questions I ask someone, I'm interviewing someone tomorrow morning for a role for one of my clients. And I imagine the answer to the question is, how's your existing pipeline is going to be? It's very strong. So my next question is, why do you want to walk away from that?
Yeah.
If you can see your number next year, why come here, go back on probation, have to have the conversation with your partner about the certainty of where you're at? Why is that attractive to you?
Yeah.
Again, it gets some very interesting answers about where they are and what they've been. I think the best CV, I don't know if I've told you this, best CV was someone who's now my partner, but I asked him, he was for a CV at one point, maybe 14, 15 years ago. And he said, I'm too busy to send you a CV, but I'll send something to you on the weekend. And it was 10 numbers, it was 10 years and 10 numbers of how they met quota. And I've not seen a better CV in my entire life.
Absolutely. Perfect.
And the nice bit about the vulnerability of, there was one year, I think at 81 at 97 or something like that, the rest were exceeded. But you're happy to be vulnerable because the next year was 150. The one before it was, some other larger number over 100. It's interesting that you must see it all the time. The effort's put into, making a good CV. Again, if you're busy making a number for someone else, do you have time to do that? How do you figure out the difference between a good and a bad CV?
Well, great question. The answer is we actually don't call for CVs. We don't believe in them, and we don't believe in cover letters. They're at their very best, they're really nice marketing documents.
Right.
And at the worst, they're bloody atrocious. But neither one, the good or the bad, is necessarily an accurate reflection of this person's capability to do the job. And from a scientific point of view, there's a lot of data out there now that absolutely confirms that the predictive reliability, the degree to which I can rely on what's put in a resume as an indicator of someone's likelihood of being successful in the future, is less than half.
Right.
So we don't call for them.
Post on the flicking the coin. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Mate, I'm going to wrap us up. But before I do, one last question, if I can. I don't know if you saw or not, but I put a post up on Monday where I spoke about the fact that it doesn't matter how much training you give to a donkey, it's never going to win the Melbourne Cup, right? And there's lots and lots of sales training businesses out there and lots of sales training being thrown at kind of middle level performers, people who are in that kind of third quartile, not the top quartile. And my proposition was that some of that, not all of it, but some of it is misspent. And that what we need to also be focusing on is the archetype, the behavior, the character. Long-winded intro to now my question. If there were 3 characteristics that you would suggest to a business owner they need to be looking for in someone who's likely to be a gun salesperson, what would those characteristics be?
Oh, wow. The last question, we've got another half hour, or we a couple of minutes for the answer. Characteristics. I think the one thing I'm really looking for is how much are you qualifying me in the interview? From that behaviour perspective.
Mm-hmm. So is that curiosity?
It's a business curiosity about how we're going to make a decision, what that process looks like, what's happened previously, why are you here, there's a whole bunch of stuff. So it's them qualifying me hard towards the end about how we make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly with my role as I come in and spend a day, a month within a business, it can be hard for them to get their head around why I'm there and those types of things. So I think ultimately that's a curiosity. And if you were new to sales, I would think, I don't know how to sharpen that, but you need to be more curious. You know, an old client of mine used to say, there's always a lead in the financial review every day. And it's that curious mind looking at it, interpreting it, and then putting that into some sort of a proposition for somebody. I think the other part is the people. I'm looking for someone who isn't talking, which is the other side of that piece.
Mm-hmm.
Who isn't telling me how good they are and were and the deals that they were working on 20 and 30 years ago. I remember when I was fresh out of high school, seeing a video from someone. I'd done a bunch of interviews that had or hadn't worked at that point. And this person was talking to school leavers around, you've got to like and trust the person you're talking to. So it's do they have a genuine desire to align and be like whoever they are, and can they shift almost that mode depending upon whether you're the CEO who doesn't want to talk to you, etc. How do we facilitate that within a meeting? And the last thing I'm really looking for, it's not really a behaviour, but it's just a proven track record. So it's someone who can talk to the fact that they're not brand new to sales, because I can't. We talk often to our clients about pegs in the tent, and when we go through and qualify deals, we just bring more pegs in the tent, so that if one of the pegs gets loose, it doesn't blow away. So we're just, how do we make more certain that this person's going to work in that environment? Because you can do well from an IT business, because you can do well in vendor land, an IBM or an Oracle or someone like that, typically means you can do matrix management really well. You can navigate a business well. When you're a small business, you don't need any of that skill set. There's a variety of things then to do with the individual, and are they going to work within my client? Do they have an appetite for learning, which is back to the curiosity piece? How about you? What are your three things?
Definitely curiosity. I think as well, one of the things that is kind of underplayed is what we describe as energy. Psychologically, it's referred to as motivational intensity. So to what degree am I motivated, self-motivated? To what degree am I driven? People often refer to that as being hungry, but it's more around, do I really have really good, strong goals that I'm in the pursuit of, and how much energy will I expend in the pursuit of those goals? And when I come up against obstacles, to what degree do they defeat me and I walk away, or do I go over, go under, go around? Those sorts of things. And then the other one, which is an interesting one, which we see sometimes as a bit of a make or break, is the degree to which the salesperson is or is not accommodating.
Right.
And just conscious of both our time, so I'll wrap this up here. But we're both familiar with that old saying of the amateur salesperson is the one who absolutely for sure knows they've got it in the bag right up to the moment they lose it. Right. And what we find with those people is they're incredibly accommodating, right? And they're acquiescing and constantly wanting to kind of meet the needs, but at the very least not displease their prospect. What I found with the most successful people is they're actually less accommodating. They've got a process, they've got a methodology, this is it, and they stick to it.
I talk about the 110-metre hurdles sometimes with my clients. The 110-metre hurdles, there's 10 hurdles to jump over. Don't keep jumping. Don't keep just jumping over the next hurdle. No, hey, if I jump over that hurdle, to your point, are we done? Or is there another 10 hurdles? Or is there a steeple to jump over?
Yeah.
As I keep acquiescing to whatever you're asking, is it actually getting me any closer to where I need to be or not?
Yeah. Cool.
It's interesting, just last wrap up point from me, that when you join Sales Director Central as an experienced sales leader, one of the things that we insist everyone does is they go through a values exercise so that we understand what your goals and ambitions are, and we can talk to you in your highest value. If you don't understand someone's value, you don't understand their currency.
Yeah, beautiful. Absolutely right. Well, there you have it, folks. I hope you've enjoyed some of the Wednesday wisdom that's been shared, particularly here by JD. JD, thanks for joining us today.
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed the conversation like I always do with you. Thank you. And folks, we'll see you again next week. Ciao for now.
Bye.